We are currently operating under a national energy emergency while the government targets 5% to 6% growth. The IMF has lowered its forecast to 4.1%. At the same time, the BSP has authorized a 6-month loan moratorium via Resolution 296 to address rising financial pressures. Today, we analyze the disconnect between these macro targets and the actual cost of living. And joining us this afternoon is Dr. Sir Percival Peña-Reyes, Senior Research Fellow of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development and an Assistant Professor at the Department of Economics of Ateneo de Manila University. A specialist in fiscal policy and institutional efficiency, his research has been pivotal in documenting the leakages within our current economic system. Good afternoon, Professor. Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Robert. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for having you again here. Now, Professor, the government maintains a growth target of 5 to 6%, yet the IMF recently adjusted their forecast down to 4.1%. Now, which data set better reflects the current momentum of the Philippine economy?
So this IMF forecast of 4.1% likely reflects current economic momentum more realistically, I think, than the government's 5 to 6% target. On the one hand, the IMF forecast is typically reactive and data-driven. So that's what you have to understand. No? It adjusts quickly to emerging constraints. And I'm referring to energy constraints, high cost of living, tighter financial conditions, and external headwinds. So the IMF incorporates these near-term frictions into its models, which is why its forecast often drops faster than our official targets. On the other hand, our government targets are aspirational and policy guiding, and they are not really just predictive. They assume policy success. So for example, when we're able to resolve energy shortages, infrastructure rollout, or improve our investment inflows. So they're meant to anchor business and investor confidence, and they often rely on second half recovery scenarios, basically betting that current problems are temporary. So this 5 to 6% range would actually reflect what policymakers want to achieve under improved conditions. So it's not necessarily what the current data is signaling. So all told, our economy is operating below its potential due to really, structural and cyclical pressures, especially energy and cost of living constraints. Now, if those are not resolved quickly, then I think the IMF projection may even prove to be more realistic.
Now, Professor, under Resolution 296, the BSP is authorizing a 6-month loan grace period because of the energy crisis. Now, does the need for a 1-year freeze on non-performing loan classifications suggest the Filipino consumer has reached a critical threshold?
Yes, very interesting. So this 6-month loan grace period is already a signal that there is cash flow stress. And it's broad enough to warrant probably system-wide relief already. Now, if we pair that with proposals about extending flexibility on NPL classification, then we're looking at regulators really trying to prevent stress from crystallizing into a larger banking problem. So what would actually confirm a true critical threshold are, several things. I think number one would be sustained rise in actual NPL ratios even after relief ends. Second, sharp drop in consumer spending, not just necessarily slower growth. A third would be banks tightening credit despite regulatory flexibility. And the fourth would be increased reliance on repeated relief measures, rolling moratoria. So if those happen, then we've probably crossed from managed stress to systemic strain. So a 1-year freeze on NPL classification does not necessarily prove that there's a collapse of some sort, but it's a signal that stress is already broad-based and policy relevant. So the system needs some time to absorb shocks, and without improvement in energy costs and real incomes, that stress could become structural.
Now, the BSP policy rate is at 4.25%, but commercial salary loans for individuals are reaching between 16 to 20%. Why is there such a significant spread between the official cost of money and what the middle class is currently paying?
All right. So that gap is actually the result of how monetary policy transmits imperfectly through a real-world banking system under stress. So we have a 4.25% policy rate set by the BSP, and it's essentially the price of short-term liquidity between banks, not the rate households borrow at. So by the time money reaches a salaried borrower, for instance, there are already going to be several layers of risk, cost, and market structure to be added on. So what that spread really is telling us is that the 4.25% versus 16 to 20% gap is a diagnostic signal. So the financial system is, well, really it's still functioning, but defensively. Households are perceived as higher risk than usual.
Yeah.
Credit is still available, but at a premium that pretty much reflects stress. So that spread doesn't necessarily mean that policy is ineffective, but it means that the binding constraint right now in the economy isn't the price of money, rather it's the perceived risk of lending to households. Until energy costs stabilize, perhaps, and real incomes recover, that spread is unlikely to compress in a meaningful way.
Now, you mentioned stress in the economy. Are you also seeing the stress in the peso exchange rate against the dollar? What are your forecasts?
Well, we're seeing right now already, we're back to that 60 to a dollar level. There was temporarily a relief, but probably we're going to still stay within that range, that the level, foreseeably.
Now, Professor, let's look back at your research back in 2014. You estimated that 40 centavos of every peso was lost to leakages in certain agencies. Now, with a record of 6.793 trillion peso budget this year, has our institutional efficiency changed since then? Or is that leakage still a factor in our current fiscal pressure?
Oh yeah, yes indeed. I think leakage is still a significant factor in today's fiscal pressure. Although leakage today is lower in some areas, perhaps even unchanged in others, and more complex overall, it likely isn't a blunt 40% loss anymore, but even at 10 to 20% inefficiency on a 6.793 trillion budget is enormous. So that's roughly 680 billion to 1.3 trillion pesos in lost value or suboptimal outcomes. That would directly feed into several things. Now, number one would be higher borrowing needs. Number two would be pressure on interest rates. And three, reduced fiscal space for social services. So the deeper issue here, if we look at it more deeply, is efficiency versus scale. The Philippines has scaled up spending significantly, but institutional capacity hasn't really scaled at the same pace. So even if percentage leakage improved, absolute leakage may have grown simply because the budget is much larger. So all told, the 40% figure is probably outdated. It's back in 2014 when that was estimated. Outdated as a blanket claim, but nonetheless, it's not meaningless. Institutional efficiency has improved in systems and processes, but outcome efficiency still probably lags behind. And today's environment, we have an energy crisis,
Yes.
slower growth, rising debt. Even little to moderate leakage could be enough to materially worsen fiscal.
Now, Professor, I asked that because there are intensifying calls to suspend the 12% VAT on fuel alongside excise taxes. Now, given the record budget, what is the economic trade-off between retaining the tax revenue to fund targeted subsidies versus the direct across-the-board relief a VAT suspension would offer at the pump?
Very interesting. So VAT suspension would be helpful in managing cash flow immediately, which matters when households are stretched. However, it tends to weaken the government's ability to respond later. So there's less revenue, there probably might be higher deficits and even more borrowing. And if there are still leakages or inefficiencies in spending, then the argument for keeping VAT only holds if subsidies would actually reach people effectively. Otherwise, you get the worst of both worlds, so to speak. Now, you get high taxes and weak relief. Now, instead of full suspension, perhaps, and economists have suggested this, no, a middle ground somewhere, no? We can consider temporary partial VAT reduction or excise adjustment paired with tight, well-targeted subsidies and clear sunset clauses. So there ought to be an automatic expiration. So this would balance immediate relief, fiscal discipline, and policy reversibility. Now, all told, VAT suspension is speedy and simple, but what you have to understand, it is also going to be costly and inefficient. Targeted subsidies are actually fiscally smarter, as many economists have been arguing, but that's going to be execution heavy and slower. Now, given current conditions, the real constraint is just policy choice, really state capacity. So if the government can deliver subsidies cleanly and quickly, keeping VAT would be perhaps better economics under that scenario. Otherwise, pressure for broad tax relief will keep rising if
Now-
we're not really effective. in
Professor, you
giving-
mentioned efficiency and faster way to release subsidies or help. Do you think right now, do you think technology should be put in place here? Because some would argue that the current subsidy distribution is still being done manually, and there's still some margin of error in terms of who gets the subsidy or the list. Sometimes some people think they're in the list, but they're not. How do you think technology should play in this?
Yes, I recall writing a paper during the pandemic. I co-wrote it with my colleague, Dr. Alvin Ang. And we were arguing that indeed we have to harness technology there. Because if we do it manually, the possibility of committing error, even corruption, would be high. So if we go back to that pandemic experience, that would really be a risk. Wrong targeting and all of these wrong accounting errors, you know.
Yes.
So I think technology would play a big part. I think that's one important lesson. And in fact, during that time, we were also suggesting that we tap into the systems of facilities used really more by classes C, D, and E. No? So this would be the likes of Palawan Pawn Shop, Smart Padala, GCash, and so forth. No? But I think since then, no, 6 years after, we've improved dramatically since then. But to that point of using technology, I think now more than ever, it's going to be important.
Still a lot of improvement that needs to be done. Now, Professor, we are currently under a state of national energy emergency. Now, to what extent is this a result of unavoidable global shocks versus the long-term trajectory of our domestic power grid and supply diversification?
Well, to be clear, it's not really mainly bad luck. Okay, global shocks lit the fuse, so to speak. But the severity of this energy emergency reflects long-standing domestic constraints in generation, grid capacity, and also fuel diversification, I think. It exposes really a lot of our structural weaknesses.
The gaps,
So,
yes.
but what we're seeing isn't just a crisis. It is, again, our structural weaknesses being exposed. The energy emergency is less about a sudden shortage and more about a system that has been operating with very little buffer. So this diagnosis affects what solutions actually work. So short-term fixes like subsidies, tax relief. These things address symptoms, but without faster capacity build out, grid upgrades, and real diversification, so that would include storage, LNG strategy, renewables integration. The same emergency conditions are likely to recur with the next global shock, no, unless we make improvements significantly.
Now, the Philippines is aiming for upper middle class income status, Professor. What are the tangible benefits of that designation for a family currently facing 4.1% inflation and soaring fuel costs today?
Great upper middle income status. No, it's great to achieve, and this is based on World Bank classification. However, it is often misunderstood as something households will feel immediately. Okay? Now, in reality, it is really more of a macro level label, an indirect relief mechanism. So for a family dealing with what you mentioned, no, 4.1% inflation,
Yes.
higher fuel costs, the benefits are indirect, gradual and conditional, but it's not immediate relief, I'm sorry to say. So whether family benefits would depend more on really, wage growth versus inflation, access to stable employment, effectiveness of subsidies and public services, and the cost of essentials, especially energy.
Now, there are frequent calls for Filipinos to increase productivity. However, we have the highest power rates in the region and double-digit interest rates. Now, what is the primary hurdle now? Or worker output or the surrounding infrastructure that we have currently?
Very interesting question. We have the tendency to blame worker productivity. Okay, but it really misses the bigger constraint, I think. In the Philippines today, the binding hurdle is really the cost and reliability of the system around the worker, especially energy, finance, and logistics. And it's not effort or capability. So if we think of productivity like this, worker output being a function of effort, tools, and environment. Okay, here in the Philippines, effort is relatively strong, I think.
Yes.
But the capital, are constrained by high borrowing costs, while the environment, and I'm referring to energy and logistics, they're expensive and uneven. So even if effort increases, overall output barely improves. So the Philippines doesn't really have a lazy workforce problem, so to speak. What it really has is high cost, low efficiency operating environment. So until energy becomes cheaper and more reliable and capital becomes more accessible, worker productivity gains will be incremental at best, I think, and structural competitiveness will probably remain constrained.
And usually, high energy cost is also a barrier to entry for foreign investments here.
Yes, yes.
Now, Professor, recent data shows a contraction in public construction amid various investigations. If infrastructure is the primary growth engine that we look at, what is the outlook for 2026 if that engine remains in its current state?
Well, if public construction, historically it's one of our most reliable growth drivers. Now, if it stays constrained, then 2026 growth will most likely undershoot the official 5 to 6% target and track closer to the lower end of forecasts or probably even below them. But the bigger issue here isn't just GDP, it's really how weakness in infrastructure cascades through the entire economy. So infrastructure, it isn't just another sector. It has one of the highest multiplier effects
Yes.
in terms of direct jobs,
Yes.
demand, and also enabling effect. No? So cheaper transport, more investment. So when all these things slow down, the impact is broad and immediate. So if infrastructure remains stalled, the Philippines does not just lose a growth engine, it will also lose the foundation that supports other engines, so to speak. In an environment already constrained by high energy costs, expensive credit and household financial stress, it becomes very difficult to compensate elsewhere.
Now, structurally, what should actually change structurally right now? In terms, you've mentioned, a lot of leakages in terms of the budget that the country has. In terms of also, it's been happening in infrastructure. What should really change? What should happen?
Well, I think we need to really have more systems thinking in monitoring corruption. So that's not really just focusing on personalities, but improving on systems and making sure that we are able to track, become more transparent in the disbursement of budget. Because right now, the way we understand anti-corruption, we're focused more on jailing people and personalities, who gets jailed or what. But really, it ought to be systems thinking. That we have to look at it as a systems problem more than anything else. Because if we continue to look at personalities and not really change the way we do things, the way we monitor and execute, then I don't really expect much change to happen meaningfully.
And as it drags on, how do you think are the effects in terms of trust and transparency?
Well, if this drags on, then of course that's going to spill over to trust because Filipinos right now demand accountability before giving trust. Now, there are studies that point to that. So I think meaningful changes ought to be reflected there before people begin to have more confidence and trust.
Sooner than later.
Yes. Yes.
Now, Professor, going back to the BSP Resolution 296, by allowing banks to defer the classification of non-performing loans for a year, what are the implications for our financial system stability when those grace periods eventually expire in 2027?
Okay, so a one-year deferral on classifying NPLs alongside the 6-month payment relief, it's essentially a time-shifting tool. So it stabilizes the system now, but it also concentrates risk into 2027, next year. So the big question here is whether problems exist. They likely do, but whether borrowers recover before the clock runs out. So the BSP isn't ignoring the risk. It's betting on, if you give the system time, the economy will grow out of the stress. Okay, but this worked reasonably well after past shocks like the pandemic. But today's constraints, we have energy costs, high borrowing rates, lower growth. All of these factors make the outcome less certain right now. So this NPL deferral stabilizes the present, but creates a potential stress test in 2027, next year. So if economic conditions do not improve by then, okay, then we might see something different, no? Okay. Now, optimistically, if conditions do improve next year, okay, this would improve the cycle, okay. Otherwise, it will compress multiple years of credit risk into a single adjustment period.
Now, in an environment of conflicting reports and money confusion, what is the single most reliable metric a Filipino family should watch to understand their actual economic standing today?
Well, I think intuitively, perhaps the best practical indicator would be the gap between your income growth and your core basket growth, so to speak. So your core basket cost growth. So I'm talking about core expense items here: food, transport, electricity, rent, and debt payments. So if income growth is less than essential cost growth, price of those things, then we are probably losing ground. No? But if income growth is greater than the essential cost growth, we are gaining ground. So forget percentages for a moment, I think, no? And let us ask ourselves. So after I pay for food, transport, electricity, rent, and my debts, no, do I have more or less left than I had last year? So that is probably our real economic direction right now. And if that gap is widening negatively, perhaps no macro narrative can offset it in lived experience, because that's something that ordinary people experience, more so nowadays.
How can you narrow that gap in terms of the macro environment and what's happening in reality on the ground in the households?
Well, right now, I think, realistically speaking, given all of these things happening, it would be, there's probably, there isn't much room for us to spend more, but to spend more wisely, I think. We have to be more judicious in our spending. If we are to go out and spend on transportation, then probably we need to be more efficient in the tasks that we do, that we are able to accomplish several tasks productively in one go, instead of going out several times to do different things. So those little things, I think, if you add them all up, would matter meaningfully, I think. If we
I guess in
spend
one
more
word, be efficient in your day-to-day, whatever activities you have. Like you said, if you're going
Yes.
to do a lot of stuff in one day, just do it in one go or in one place.
Yes,
Minimize
yes.
costs.
You go out purposibly.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, Professor, for joining us this afternoon and for your insights and advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.